All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second of two vulnerability assessment webinars. Thank you for accommodating the slight switch to a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar function. We're excited to bring you some draft results today, hopefully get a little bit of feedback and generate some discussion. We will also be bringing this to the IMPO tech and policy boards, as well as to the broader stakeholder committee. But we're very interested in your feedback as kind of technical experts for this kind of highly technical analysis of the transportation network. All right, quick agenda today. So we'll give you just a brief overview of the project, just to remind you and get you kind of back in the headspace here, since it's been a few weeks since we have convened this group. We'll go over the vulnerability assessment specific to transportation, including the criteria that went into the analysis, including the threats and assets that were identified by the public and stakeholders as well. And then we have some draft results of the assessment to show you today in terms of how well these assets can respond to threats. Next, we'll walk you through the criticality assessment. So these two things will be plotted together to assess kind of all assets in the region for their vulnerability to future threats. So we'll walk you through some of the criteria that was used to score each asset and some draft results as well. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. So I want to give you just kind of a quick project overview here. Just a reminder that this is the Central Indiana Regional Resiliency Snapshot by the Indianapolis IMPO. We have kind of three main goals for this planning project. The first is to assess regional holistic resilience. So this includes transportation as well as other assets like natural areas in terms of how well is the region in general prepared to handle future shocks and stressors. A second goal here is also to position the region to pursue federal funding. This assessment of transportation infrastructure is linked to the federal PROTECT funding program that has a very long acronym. So we refer to it as the PROTECT program. And that is designed to fund resiliency improvement projects for the transportation infrastructure for the region. And then the third piece here is to just generally identify vulnerabilities for the region as well as the transportation network. So those are kind of our three main objectives here. Next slide, please. This is a quick update on where we are in terms of project timeline and tasks. We are still engaging our stakeholders and are going to continue public engagement as we develop kind of these holistic recommendations from the plan, as well as this assessment of transportation infrastructure. We have already kind of identified the resources and threats for the region through a public input process, as well as the stakeholder meetings. And so we're currently in these two tasks identified in yellow here. So we have draft results for the risk-based assessment of transportation infrastructure today, as well as we'll be developing some of the recommendations for vulnerability for the region, as well as for the transportation infrastructure. So we hope to get a little bit of feedback from you all today. And then the last task here is just related to regional data tracking, that is identifying where there might be some gaps in data that would be helpful to fill as a result of looking at the region and this assessment of transportation. Next slide, please. At this stage, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Windmiller. She's with our consulting team with Cambridge Systematics to walk us through some of the background on this assessment.
Thanks, Annie, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, walk through the vulnerability assessment and the results, but quick refresher from last time. Last workshop, we included an overview of what vulnerability means and the VAST tool, which is the way that we assessed vulnerability, and the different components that went into this analysis. And just as a refresher, vulnerability, it's really measuring how well our assets and our system can cope with different hazards and threats, some that might be definitely on the horizon, and others that might be, if or when it happens. And it can include climate ones, weather related, or even human-made types of hazards and threats. And for this analysis, we're looking at three overall measures of vulnerability and taking all those in consideration to get a final vulnerability assessment. This includes the exposure. So this is looking at if the asset could be exposed to said hazard. So for flooding, for example, seeing if an asset is in a floodplain. So if we get a lot of rain or a lot of snow that then melts, could the roadway or the bridge be flooded or be impacted by said flooding effects? So that's measuring exposure. The second one is sensitivity. So it's seeing, okay, if it is exposed to said hazard, how would this asset fare based off of the exposure? So looking at things like what's the current condition of the roadway and the bridge? Is it an old bridge? Is it a new bridge? Things like that nature. And then the third one is looking at this adaptive capacity. So if said asset would be closed or you would hear from an official to avoid the area, seeing how well the region could cope due to this hazard. So some of them might be, is it along a major route? Is it a main thoroughfare that a lot of vehicles travel on? Is it a primary truck route? Is there detours available? Can you just go down one block, or do you have to go many minutes out of your way in order to get from point A to point B? So all three of those are taken into account to get a final vulnerability score that we put on a general low to high scale. And we've completed all of this using the FHWA's VAST tool. This is a free Excel-based tool. You can go on their website, download it. It does frankly, a really good job of walking through the different steps to complete a vulnerability assessment, including the data that they need, how to organize the data, and even suggestions on, what could you include as an exposure measure? What are different hazards and threats you could include, and even some sources where you can get that data. So this framework that we use for vulnerability, we're following VAS's tool and FHWA's guidance. So since we've talked, we have results that we have completed the VAS tool. So we're going to walk through some of the outputs that we have for the vulnerability assessment, but also a quick reminder, okay, what went into VAST? So the main inputs, we're looking at a defined set of threats and a defined set of transportation assets. For threats, we have around 15 or 16, I can't remember exactly which number, but we have many different threats and hazards in the region. And this was based off of outreach that we conducted to the public. We had different stakeholder meetings and advisory groups seeing what's on our list. Are we missing anything? Can we take off anything? And then asking, can you rank these? What's the highest threats to central Indiana? What's maybe towards the bottom of the list, but we still want to highlight as actually being a threat to the region. And this also follows the county hazard mitigation plan. So trying to link our assessment to other assessments that have completed in the region. So with all these threats, you have to assess one by one individually. So to make it more manageable, we selected the top 4. This includes extreme heat, flooding, winter storm, and tornadoes. And we're going to see how well these threats impact the different transportation assets. And for this, we've selected roadways and bridges. And as a reminder, just a little nuance in the analysis for our transportation assets, we're concentrating on functional class 3 through 6. So these are other principal arterials through minor collectors. And this reflects what the state has control over and the IMPO has some say and influence over. So other assets like the interstates and local roadways won't be included in this, but can definitely be part of a future endeavor or something done at the state or local level. So after we determined what are our different threats, what are our different assets, We then have to fill in these three main components: the exposure, the sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. How are we going to measure each of these? For this table shows the different data that we're pointing to when we talk about each of these different measures. For extreme heat, we're looking at the projected annual average number of hot days and uncomfortable nights. This comes from the Indiana University Environmental Resiliency Institute. And we have this for 2030 and an estimate for 2050. For flooding, we're looking at the Indiana Best Available Floodplain Map from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. We're also looking at it in 2030 and did a kind of a separate analysis to project this out to 2050. For tornado, we're looking at the Tornado Risk Index rating. This is from FEMA. And winter weather, also from FEMA, we have the Winter Weather Risk Index rating. So all of these, we're able to map them spatially to see, okay, is the asset going to be exposed to these different hazards and at what scale? So for extreme heats, it's not going to be one roadway and then the parallel roadway is or isn't. It's going to be, is one part of the region expected to be warmer than the other part of the region? That type of analysis. For sensitivity, we're looking at the road or the pavement and the bridge condition. For pavement condition, this is based off of the county pavement conditions that we got directly from the LPAs. However, not all of this is available region-wide and is not spatially mapped. So we've supplemented with the pavement condition, the IRA or IRI rating from the Highway Performance Monitoring System, or the HPMS, which is a nationwide data set of roadway assets and conditions, as well as things like volumes and truck percentage and different roadway characteristics like that. So, and then for bridge, we got the bridge condition from the National Bridge Inventory. Similarly, this is a nationwide data set that marks where all the bridges and culverts and similar assets are across the nation, and then the different characteristics of said bridge and culverts, such as the condition. So we use that for all of the sensitivity when we're looking at all the different hazards. And then for adaptive capacity, there's a few different ways you could look at this. For this one, we selected network density. So the assumption is if this roadway asset or if this bridge would close, or an official would say, avoid this area, take another detour, how many adjacent or parallel or perpendicular assets are there to get around said hazard? So do you need to just go a block over, such as in downtown Indianapolis, to avoid that particular road? Or do you have to go maybe 10, 20 minutes out of your way in order to still get to point A to point B? So this is really looking at, if it would close, how much can someone adapt to that asset being out of commission, at least for a temporary time. So the next few slides will show the different results we have. We're separating it out by the different hazards between roadways and bridges, and then we're available between the 2030 outlook and then the 2050 outlook. So this first one is looking at extreme heat for the different roadways. The map on the left is 2030, and the map on the right is 2050. And the darker colors represent that roadway asset being what we've bucketed as the higher vulnerability when compared to the other roadways in the region. So for heat, the uncomfortable days, uncomfortable nights, it's similar to when you think of the nation, how heat travels. It's the southern portion of the nation is a lot hotter than the northern portion. So that's being reflected in this data as well. As you're moving farther south in the region, the number of these uncomfortable days and nights increases compared to the northern part of the region. And then the adaptive capacity, so our network density, is really being shown as well, particularly in 2030, where in downtown Indianapolis, you have a lot of alternative routes as compared to even farther in Marion County and the other counties as well. So that's why kind of the hole is there, we believe. Okay. Then moving on, this is the same analysis, extreme heat, vulnerability, 2030 on the left, 2050 on the right, but this is looking at bridges. Again, these are bridges on functional class 3 through 6, and there's a similar result where the farther south you move, the more an asset is likely to be on that higher vulnerability scale. And I'm pausing a little bit so you can absorb it, but if you need a longer time to take a look, and I can always go back if you want to take a closer look as well. Okay, so our second hazard is looking at flooding, and this is based off of the best available floodplain map. So there's, the river, of course, running through the region, but also a lot of these different streams and creeks that are kind of shown throughout the region. So looking at the vulnerability results, it is, I don't want to say scattered throughout the region, but it's not concentrated in one location necessarily. It's every county has at least a high vulnerability road, particularly in 2050. So that's the roads. And then next slide is the bridges. And for this one in particular, a lot of our lower vulnerable road or bridges are being highlighted in Marion County. And I believe the network density analysis is really driving that result because you're able to get to another bridge, another roadway, if said one would not be safe to drive on for a limited amount of time. This next one's looking at tornadoes. For this, we didn't get a good data source and one that we felt comfortable using for 2050. So we were only looking at 2030 for this particular analysis. So in this case, the left map is showing the roads in 2030, and the right map is showing the bridges in 2030. And kind of similar to the flooding, this is not necessarily concentrated on any one location. It's fairly scattered throughout the region, so it really depends on the pavement and the road condition and the network density. Because as I'm sure you might assume with tornadoes, it's kind of hard to pinpoint. It's going to be on this road, but not the 1 mile over. It's kind of looking at it at a larger scale. And then our last asset is looking at winter weather vulnerability. Again, with this one, we didn't find a data set that we felt comfortable for 2050. So the map on the left is the 2030 roadway network. Then the map on the right is the 2030 bridge network. And similar to tornadoes, you don't get snow in one place and not in a mile farther from that one location. So it is fairly scattered throughout the region. I would say bridges, it is more the areas outside of Marion County have a higher vulnerability. And again, I believe that's because of the network density analysis where you have less alternative routes if something would close, or maybe there's a lot of ice on there and it's not safe to drive over or something like that. Okay, so I showed you a lot of maps in a fairly short period of time. So I wanted to pause here to see one, are there any results that you're surprised or not what you expected? Any questions, or do you want me to go back to any? Just kind of get your feedback on how you think the resiliency results turned out.
Sarah, I do have a question. Can you
Mhm.
go back to the heat
Sure.
roads slide? And you mentioned it and I didn't catch it. Why is the downtown Indianapolis like not or more medium and everything around it is high?
hmm So I believe that's because of the network density component. So the adaptive capacity measure, um, we selected network density to see basically what would the detour situation look like. And in downtown Indy, if you have one road that's closed, it's like, well, I can just go down a block and still get to point A to point B. And then, as you naturally get out of the downtown Indianapolis area, that length of the detour and the different options you have start going down.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, sure.
Sarah?
Mhm.
I just wanted, this is Karen, I just wanted to add, this also does not take into account heat island information, so your
Yeah.
heat island information would be very different, This is more surface temperature.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or any surprises or things make sense? Any thumbs up of, yeah, it looks good, or I just go through them one by one. I think we have, is that someone? I thought I
Yeah,
heard someone.
sorry. Let me get a little closer. I just had a question about how you guys did the flooding measurement. Like, did you just use the existing kind of like federal flood maps that are out there, or did you also kind of incorporate like, because I know there have been some discussion about like um future future floods might be worse than like were previously anticipated, especially with like the Dig Indy project, where there are concerns that there may not be as much capacity based on the estimates that they did when they started the project.
Mhm. Yeah, so for flooding, actually kind of have it on hand a little bit. Let me open up this map. For flooding for 2030 in particular, we used the Department of Natural Resources, their best available floodplain map. So basically any area that's not in this light kind of UNC blue was considered not in a floodplain. So we're really concentrating on assets that intersect a floodway, a 100-year floodplain, or a 500-year floodplain. So that's information for 2030. For 2050, the government doesn't necessarily project out and have like multiple future years for floodplains. So for that, we use precipitation estimates for the future, assuming more it rains, the more likely flooding is to happen.
Right.
So we use the NOAA state climate summaries for that, assuming like I think it was 2 inches as an extra 2 inches of precipitation, and use that to see, okay, based off of the NOAA data, which areas would have that increase.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to
Then
the gun on the presentation, but are we able to talk about like how this information will be used to plan for facilities in the future? I'm thinking, I guess, looking at flooding specifically, how it will be used to plan stormwater infrastructure projects and that sort of thing over the next several decades. And hi, I'm Scott. I'm sitting in for Jill today. You guys are probably more familiar with her, but she's at a conference and asked me to sit in today.
That's a good question. So I can jump in with something, and Sarah, if you want to add anything, or Karen. One kind of goal of this analysis was to position the region for federal funding. So by doing functional classes 3 through 6, the idea is to produce a kind of a prioritized list of projects and assets based on vulnerability. So what are the most vulnerable assets in the region to these different threats, and that could position the municipality or whoever owns those assets to pursue federal protect funding to increase the resiliency of those assets, should they so choose. That's something that IMPO doesn't have control over the asset, but that's one potential pathway. I can't speak to the future kind of stormwater planning, but something that we can do is, based on this analysis, take that as a recommendation in the plan to increase in these specific areas stormwater infrastructure, or other recommendations from this group or the stakeholder group as well. So that's something that we could recommend in the plan as a result of the analysis as well.
Thanks.
that was my immediate thought too, of that's an excellent recommendation to include in our plan. And we'll have a set of recommendations for each of our different threats, with a bit more concentration on these ones that we did in the vast analysis. So yeah, we can definitely include that.
Yeah, we have we just finished our Indiana Water Summit last month, and we'll have a white paper coming out, and it does look at some of these issues and how we plan for stormwater infrastructure into the future. So I'll try to remember to make sure that gets to your hands, so you have that on hand.
Great.
That would be appreciated.
And I did see, okay. Nice, thank you. I was looking at the chat. Any other questions or thoughts? And while we're on the topic of recommendations, that's our last question we'll have for you, to get some more ideas for recommendations. So hold on to those. Okay. So in that case, yeah, let's move on to criticality. And if anything comes to mind, feel free to drop it in the chats. And then of course we'll have time at the end to answer additional questions or ideas as well. So for criticality, this is a different analysis than our vulnerability one looking at VAST, because VAST is very concentrated on the different hazards and the different assets and this condition of those, but doesn't necessarily consider other outside sources. So criticality, it is looking at, what's the asset's importance, what's its usage, but it's also looking at the surrounding socioeconomic characteristics and other factors that VAST you could take into account, but in our analysis, where we just concentrate on the assets, it wasn't taken into account. And in particular, this is a fantastic place to put into and start considering equity in our analysis. So just to look at, when I say socioeconomic characteristics and surrounding usage and importance, these are the different factors that we considered. So we're looking at 3 different buckets: mobility and use, connectivity, and equity in people. So the mobility and use, this one somewhat, not really, in some way being considered in our vast analysis. So looking at things like what's the functional class, with the assumption that the functional class 3 and 4 are more key routes and roadways in the region than functional classes 5 and 6. What's the total ADT and the roadway volume on those different links? What's the truck ADT? And then the transit frequency. So looking at really how are people using said assets? What's the movement along that different roadway and the different bridge? The connectivity, this one in particular, I think takes a nice, not vast, but it's kind of taking a step away from it and looking at other different factors as well. So we're looking at access to hospitals. So how many hospitals are surrounding the different assets? Similarly, looking at grocery stores, as well as connectivity to other transportation infrastructure, particularly non-motorized transportation infrastructure, so bikeways and sidewalks and different trails in the region. And then the last criticality factor, looking at equity in people. So things like population density, employment density, where people live and work, and then this disadvantaged communities or social vulnerability consideration as well. And we've applied different weights to these, and this is based off of feedback that we received from our stakeholders and then our public outreach as well. There's a little exercise where you can put dots on, you know, which of these factors do you think are most important, that you think should be a higher weight. So based off of this, there was I believe a fairly overwhelming response to equity in people. So that takes the bulk of it, with further from that, the bulk of it looking at disadvantaged communities and social vulnerability. And you can see the distribution from there as well. So a nice mixture of how these factors are being considered. And then this analysis, I'm going to go back a few slides. This analysis is completed. We're looking at all these different factors individually, and then basically stacking them together to see, okay, how well does an asset, or I should say like with an asset, what's its total ADT? Is it on the higher side in the region? Is it on the lower side? How many grocery stores does it have access to? What's the employment density? So taking all of these things, stacking them together to get a single criticality score. And looking at the same assets, so this is, again, looking at functional classification 3 through 6. This is the results. The darker colors is the highest criticality, so the ones that are checking the most boxes, depending on the weights that were applied to them. And then the more yellow color is the lower end of the criticality. So city centers popping up the most, where, you know, we have transit access, we have a lot of different grocery stores, high population and employment density, things like that. So I'll pause here a little bit so you can absorb the results. And as you were going through this, the next slide has basically the same question as we had as vulnerability. Are there any surprises? Is it what's expected? Do you have any questions with this? Just wanting your feedback on this analysis.
I'll take the silence as we nailed it.
Okay. And again, if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to drop in the chat or, you know, contact myself or Annie. So now that we've seen vast and we've seen criticality, in our analysis, we're really starting to pivot towards the recommendation side. So we see which assets are, rising to the surface. We're going to do a prioritization analysis, so take into consideration both the vast results and the criticality results. But a big part of this snapshot and this report and all this analysis is really the recommendation side. So we wanted to get your feedback on what some recommendations are to improve resiliency against these 4 different threats. So the extreme heat, the flooding, winter weather, and tornadoes.
So I wanted to just add a couple of things here to maybe get some
Mhm.
juices flowing here as well. Sarah, can you go way back to the chart of sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and the threats, please? Yeah, here we go.
This one.
So, on the topic of, we were discussing earlier the Dig Indy project, and the role of maybe recommending improvements to stormwater infrastructure related to the flooding threat, as well. So, as we kind of talk about recommendations to increase resiliency for the region and then specifically for the transportation infrastructure, you probably noticed that as we were talking about something like, say, extreme heat, the downtown Indianapolis was not highlighted as high because of that kind of network density piece, as Sarah described. So something that could come out of the recommendations to increase resiliency could be related to, we need to work on this urban heat island effect to make sure that we don't see increased issues in urban centers like downtown Indianapolis or in some places in Hamilton County. Or the alternative is, we wouldn't want a recommendation to come out of this plan that says something like, oh, we just need to increase network density in the places that are ranked as high. Like, is that the solution that should be proposed, to just increase your emergency evacuation routes in response to these threats? Or is it, do we work on mitigation to increase the resiliency of the actual assets themselves? So I think that's kind of some of the input that we're looking at here. You can focus on any one of these kind of 3 areas that are contributing to the overall vulnerability of an asset. So, like, focusing on reducing the total number of uncomfortable nights and hot days versus increasing the condition or improving the condition of an asset, or this adaptive capacity density piece. So I think that's some of the feedback that we're looking for now. I see we have a question in the chat, because the highest priority seems to be in downtown Indy. Is that where the work improvements will be done? So, from one point of view, like, the city of Indianapolis has control over the kinds of projects that they implement, and where those are located. I wouldn't say, based on some of these threats, that in downtown Indianapolis is the most at risk. The spread seems to be regional in terms of how these threats are going to impact the transportation network. I think it's something that we could discuss or include in recommendations. Did I answer your question here?
I feel like the difficult thing when it comes to this sort of stuff is that a lot of the solutions for this seem to not really be like directly transportation. Like flooding and extreme heat could both be addressed by kind of like low impact developments. you know, that's more kind of like land use stormwater solutions than necessarily a transportation solution. Thinking about tornadoes, I'm wondering if there's any kind of case study of the previous Johnson County tornadoes and like how that kind of impacted access, if that's something that could be looked at and learned from.
Can you expand a little more on that last piece? Are you suggesting we recommend something like taking a deeper dive into that specific threat for those southern counties?
I guess I meant just like just seeing like what happened in Johnson County. Like this tornado came through. What exactly did it do? Because it crossed over. Did it cross over 65 or 69, or it came very close? Not 69. It must have been 65. So like, how did that impact? You know, how did that impact access across its whole kind of like swath? And I guess like what lessons could be learned to respond to those conditions that tornadoes create more effectively, which again like is more like that's more like a emergency service, I guess, kind of project. But I mean, to your point about the more like dense network points, you know, maybe that's a policy solution or a infrastructure solution there.
I think we're interested in those recommendations as well for the overall snapshot too, since we can't separate land use from transportation, from economic development, from housing, etc. Sarah, can you move to the tornado slide?
Sure.
Thanks. So when we take a look at these results on the map on the left, these are the roadway assets. You can see like Johnson County and Shelby County really jump out as having higher concentrations of high vulnerability assets, which I think is consistent with the recent kind of emergency declarations by the governor during those tornado periods earlier in 2023. So I think I would put this question to Nick and Susan as well, related to, so we're having this conversation about where to concentrate improvements or policy recommendations. What would you like to see? Would you like to see infrastructure investments to make existing assets more resilient based on this data, or are you interested in seeing policy recommendations to mitigate the threats of, say, climate change that will increase the impacts or the frequency of these threats? I think that's what we're hoping to get from this group and the public, as well as stakeholders as well.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm curious about, I'm sure for the funding that you weren't required to do like 1,000-year flood information, but I'm just curious about how policy might consider with going into development these type of hazards like critical facilities, how that historically has been handled once you get your recommendations.
So just to make sure that I am capturing this correctly, are you interested in the planning horizon that's beyond what we've assessed for these threats? You mentioned the 1,000-year floodplain. I want to make sure I'm capturing your feedback correctly here.
Yeah, that was like 2 different points, sorry.
Okay.
Because Kentucky, the Eastern Kentucky flooding could happen here as well with extreme weather. So I'm just wondering if that might be considered down the road, the 1,000-year floodplain. And then the second one is, how historically has your recommendations affected policy in the whole region?
Oh, okay. Very different question. All right, let me get my thoughts together here. Usually, as part of our planning efforts, we make these recommendations in these planning documents and bring them to our board, which includes elected officials from municipalities from around the region. So these are representatives from cities, towns, and counties, as well as we have some transit agencies that sit on the board as well. And so we provide this information to them based on stakeholder feedback, public feedback, for adoption by them to say, here's the results of the analysis that we have found, and here's some potential ways and recommendations to move forward based on this. So we bring this information and recommendations to that body, but it's ultimately up to those elected officials and members on how they implement those recommendations.
Yes, that answered that question. Thank you.
I think that your two options that you kind of presented, Annie, it's definitely both, I would say, because I mean, infrastructure should be made to be more resilient, especially, you know, given the conditions of some of the bridges around here, and the future threats that we're facing, but also, you know, the policy recommendations that address those side contributors to you know, like what we spoke about earlier with using low impact development to address stormwater issues, you know, taking a look at your land use. I mean, you know, one of the, I don't think this was really, you know, covered here, but I mean, one consideration is, you know, the energy grid when it comes to heat. And also you get into these suburbs and the way that they're designed, you have, you know, maybe one access or two. If something happens to that access, then what happens? Then what happens to the people who live there? How do rescuers get back in there to address their needs or deliver service? So I mean, I guess like zooming out, redundancy is probably really important in terms of providing service, providing access. I'm just thinking off the cuff, so someone stop me.
I was just going to jump in and agree with you. I think you're going to need policy support to help compel some of the resiliency to build into the system. I think more data, a stronger data network, so we understand where more of the risk can occur. And I'm really speaking most specifically to the water stuff. But also, you know, I think really leaning into the low impact development, green infrastructure stuff. I mean, as we know now, if we're going to try to engineer more stormwater off the roadway using, you know, the old pipe systems, we may just end up having this network effect where we push it all downstream and make a high risk situation out of one that's currently a lower risk situation. So being able to store that stormwater on the landscape is going to be increasingly important. And ultimately, I mean, that's a cheaper solution than having to refit a lot of that hardened infrastructure underground to accommodate the larger stormwater flows.
So I have two follow-ups to that. I'm taking notes here, so thank you all for the comments that you've made so far. Related to the data point that you just mentioned, Scott, do you have a specific data set in mind that is an identified gap from your work with White River that you'd like to see improved upon or brought to the region that we can include as a recommendation here?
Well, we're working on that right now. We have a proposal in front of a couple different groups to build out a more robust water monitoring network. So, I mean, that really is statewide, and it is intended to monitor a number of different conditions, but flow would be one of those. Kelly with our office, I think, is more familiar with where our data collection is within the county or within this area, I guess. She understands that stuff better than I do. And I would probably direct you to her for more information on that. But understanding those flows, having a monitoring network that can understand those flows may help predict where some of those issues could occur. I guess in a real-time way, because obviously your data here has done a really good job predicting some of that. So, I think as things develop, as we really get that rain hitting the landscape over the next several decades, understanding in a real time where some of those excess flows are occurring may be helpful.
Right, this would definitely be more granular, and we've heard this this item before related to the lack of groundwater monitoring points in the region. So we've definitely heard this before. That's something that we can include as a recommendation to support your work. So that's actually a good segue. I know we're getting a little tight on time here, but another way to think about this question is how can these recommendations support your work at White River Alliance or yours, Susan, in emergency management departments? What do you need to see included in this plan and these recommendations to help support your work, to have another document to point to that says this regional resiliency snapshot also identifies XYZ as being an important next step?
I would like to say that mitigation of these hazards seems to be like huge investment that will reap dividends downstream, pardon the pun. So we're trying to look at that more and more, and definitely want to promote all kinds of funding and all kinds of perhaps nature-based solutions. I don't know what groups will ultimately end up working with that, but I've been working with the regional silver jackets, and they're also trying to plug for stream gauges, etc., to monitor these kind of things. So it's exciting times to be a part of this, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you for your participation, Susan. It's been really helpful.
I would just lean on floodplains, preserving the ones we still can, capturing the ones that we can, preserving wetlands, building up stream resiliency, so riparian corridors and that sort of thing. And then really, as I said, leaning on green infrastructure and monitoring, I think would probably be some of the biggest things. But I do think, like Nick said, I think policy is going to be a big piece of how that is implemented.
Absolutely. Sarah, you want to migrate to, we actually drafted up some potential recommendations, and I think I started the discussion before I even offered these up to also get uses flowing as well. So these are some examples of potential threat specific mitigation recommendations that can be included in the plan. These are just drafts and ideas also. So in our last few minutes, if anyone wants to recommend, support, discourage any of these as well. These are just some ideas. Policy is definitely rising to the top here, as it does.
I think shade is a big thing that hasn't really been discussed as much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Throwing that out there.
The feedback that we received from the public was very focused on climate change as well as the urban heat island effect, and that kind of rose to the top as a piece here. So we can include shade or shelters and reducing that impact or filling some data gaps related to the urban heat island effect as well.
Trees are great for stormwater interception as well. There's a lot of tension, I think, in some neighborhoods on accepting trees and dealing with everything they bring with them, with the leaves and whatnot. But definitely should be a tool in the toolbox.
Any other comments, feedback, questions?
Yeah, Susan put in the chat. Yeah, another support for trees, planting trees downtown, rooftop plantings.
I don't know a ton about this, but I did hear very recently from another city that has done some reflective pavement installations that there's some concern that the heat that's reflected ends up being passed on to pedestrians if it's a pedestrian heavy area and having kind of the opposite of the desired effect. So I don't know what kind of research or case studies might be out there on that, but just wanted to make that small note.
No, that's helpful. I hadn't heard that.
Like it might, maybe it's a better option for like, thoroughfares and highways and places that aren't, that should, everything should be pedestrian friendly, but you know what I'm saying? In a downtown core, it might be, counterintuitive.
Right. We also are aware that Marion County and Keep Indianapolis Beautiful are working on a tree equity analysis and mapping existing trees and green infrastructure in Marion County specifically. So those results will be out later as well. Not that that specifically relates to pavement, but I'm hearing a lot of policy, urban heat island effect, nature-based solution recommendations, that low impact development and green infrastructure, and increasing or filling in some of these data gaps are kind of the summary of what I'm hearing from this group. In our last minute here, Sarah, can you jump one more? I think it's one more slide. Two more slides. Rough timeline here. We're looking at doing some public outreach this month and next month. We'll be convening our stakeholder committee in October as well. That meeting date has not been set yet, but we will be getting that on the calendar as well. They will be seeing these draft results as well as the draft results of the snapshot, and we're marching towards recommendations at the end of this year or early next, worst case scenario. So I know we are at time here. Thank you so much for your input today. I will put in the chat the project website has the first webinar recording in this series, and it will have this one as well. It also will have other information about the project and ways to get in contact with us if you have additional feedback that we have missed, or if you think of something later. But thank you so much for your time today. Oh, here's my contact information as well. I believe that's all we've got. Let me put this link in the chat before we end the meeting here. This is on the IMPO website. This is the Regional Resiliency Snapshot. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to rolling out final recommendations and a final plan to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Gonna stop the recording if I can.